So the water and carbon cycle. So the learning outcome for this lesson is students should be able to describe cycling of matter, including that of carbon and water, associating it with biological and atmospheric phenomena as well. So matter and water are cycled through nature, through biological systems or through living organisms, and it also results in atmospheric phenomena like things like rain, things like that we see. So that's kind of like what you need to learn and understand this learning outcome. So specifically what we're going to look at here are carbon stores, carbon transferring processes such as photosynthesis, respiration, burning, the carbon cycle diagram, limestone formation, acid rain reaction with limestone, and water stores. We're going to look at water transferring processes such as transpiration, evaporation, condensation, atmospheric pressure, cloud formation, rain, the water cycle diagram. We're going to look at some lab methods that you can use to detect CO2 using lime water. Also lab investigations to look for the presence of water, H2O, using copper sulfate. Transpiration investigation, so that's looking at a way that plants lose water, for example, through their leaves, and that's what we're going to focus on in this lesson. So this here, just very kind of briefly, this is what's known as the carbon cycle. So carbon, if you like, is an element, and the carbon cycle is like how that carbon element is passed through nature. So we have decomposers, decomposition from dead plants and animals. So for example, animals carry carbon in their body, and when they die, what happens is that carbon gets decomposed and it goes back into nature. And then so that's one way that carbon can come out of living organisms and go back into the environment. So that's kind of like one, if you like, step in the cycle. Other ways that carbon can get into the atmosphere, and we're going to talk about in detail, is respiration. So the way that organisms make their energy is what's known as respiration, and that involves the production of CO2, carbon dioxide. So what can happen is that's a way that all living organisms respire. So therefore, that's how they get their energy from food, and therefore as a result they put CO2 into the air, including ourselves. Other ways then as well that carbon dioxide or carbon gets into the air as well is through combustion. So during the Industrial Revolution, humans figured out how to burn fuels, and as a result of that, that's releasing huge amounts of CO2 that's trapped in fossil fuels back into the environment as well. And then just one of the ways that carbon dioxide is taken out of the air is through the process of photosynthesis. The way that plants make their own food, what they do is they take CO2 in from the atmosphere and they take it in through their leaves, and then they use that to create glucose, and then they use the glucose then to respire. That's just a kind of very high level overview of the carbon cycle, but we're going to look at it now in detail. So these two processes of photosynthesis and respiration are really important in nature and in relation to the carbon cycle. So try and pause the video and remember what's the formula for photosynthesis and what's the formula for respiration. So the formula for photosynthesis, so let's think about what plants take in. So plants take in carbon dioxide, which is CO2. So they take in CO2 from the atmosphere, from the environment, and they take that in through their leaves. Then they also take up H2O, and they take up H2O, which is water. They take this up through their roots, through the root system. So photosynthesis, for example, like this is one way that carbon gets taken out of the atmosphere and is put into plants. And then what happens then, through the process of photosynthesis, you've chlorophyll, Okay, so the chlorophyll is like a green substance that gives plants their green color. And then you also have sunlight as well. So chlorophyll and sunlight. And what the plant does then is it takes these two molecules, so carbon dioxide and water, and it makes glucose, which is C6H12O6. Okay, so that's glucose. And it also produces O2, oxygen, and also energy. Sorry, well, not energy. That's the food. That's the food that it makes. Okay, so this is carbon dioxide here and water. So the plant takes the carbon dioxide in through the atmosphere, and it takes water up through its root system, and then it turns that into glucose. Okay, which is what it uses to make its energy. That's its food. And it also produces O2, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, and it releases this O2 back into the environment. And it also releases excess water as well back into the environment. And this glucose then is stored, if you like, in the plant itself. And what happens then is, so if you think about it, so what's happening is carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide has been taken out of the atmosphere, and it's been absorbed, if you like, it's been absorbed into the plant. And so it's gone from in the atmosphere here to in the plant here. And then what happens then is through this process of respiration. So respiration is the way that organisms get energy from food. So what food do they use? Well, they use glucose, and we this is what we use as well. So respiration is just really the reverse of this process here. So for example, you're going to have glucose, C6H12O6, okay, plus O2. So this is why we breathe, and organisms breathe, they have to take in oxygen. And what happens then is they use this and they produce carbon dioxide, CO2, plus H2O. Okay, so water vapor plus energy. Plus energy. And so what essentially, how does, like most organisms, they consumers, what they do is they have to eat plants or eat other animals to get their glucose. They breathe in oxygen from the environment. And then what they do is they break this up and they make energy. So the body is carrying out respiration in order to get energy. And then what happens then is that that energy is used to for the body to function, for the different functions in the body, and then it's also used as well to heat the body and keep the body warm. Water vapor then, so any excess water that's not used is eliminated through the body when you breathe, for example. And we use the breathing system to get oxygen into the body and then to get carbon dioxide out of the body. So again, you can see how, so the carbon dioxide is in the environment here. It's absorbed into the plants, into this molecule here. Other organisms come along to eat the plants, so it goes from the plants into the organism that eats them. So some of that carbon will be used in the body, but then a lot of that carbon goes back, it's breathed back out into the environment through respiration. It goes back into the environment from CO2, and then this cycle can continue again here. So this is, if you like, a major component in this carbon cycle. So essentially we're talking about this element here, carbon, that's getting transferred around in nature through these processes of photosynthesis and respiration. That's one of the, there are two of the ways that carbon is cycled through the environment. Okay, so let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So carbon stores. So the main stores of carbon on Earth. So carbon stores are like places where carbon is stored. So this here, so carbon is the sixth element on the periodic table. It has the chemical symbol C, and it has an atomic mass of 12 atomic mass units. And carbon is really important in nature, as we've seen. It's the backbone of a lot of very important molecules and very important processes like photosynthesis and respiration. So this is kind of like what pure elemental carbon looks like. And essentially coal is a form of carbon. Okay, it's decomposed decomposed animals and organisms that is compressed into coal, and then we can burn it, so we can release the energy and also release carbon dioxide back into the air. But when we talk about carbon stores, it's like the places where there's an awful lot of carbon. So we have the atmosphere. Okay, so the atmosphere mainly has carbon dioxide, so CO2, but it also has shorter-lived methane, which is CH4. Okay, so it's carbon with 4 hydrogens attached onto it. So you have these two molecules, carbon dioxide and methane. So carbon dioxide, it kind of looks like this. So it's a carbon, it has 2 oxygens attached onto it like this. So you have this carbon, and then you have methane, which is carbon with 4 hydrogens attached onto it like this. Okay, so this is carbon here. So this is the important element, and carbon here as well. So carbon forms, if you like, the backbone to a lot of molecules that are found in nature. So the atmosphere, okay, so that's one place where you get a lot of are what are known as carbon stores. The other carbon stores are living organisms. So living organisms contain many different carbon compounds, such as fats, proteins inside each of its cells. When organisms die and decompose to form humus, okay, so humus is like a brown kind of blacky kind of substance that's found in the ground. Okay, so living organisms are a huge carbon store. So we can refer to that as the biosphere. Okay, so all of the living organisms in the environment, so which is the biosphere. So basically, they are like carbon is a very important element that makes up like all of the different like proteins and fats that make up that organism. So they're full of carbon. So again, living organisms are a store of carbon. So even as well, when you think about hair, so for photosynthesis, for example, like green plants are taking in carbon, so they're going to have carbon inside their system in the form of glucose, and also in the form of proteins and other fats as well. So that's where animals are a huge source of carbon in the environment. So living organisms. Then we have what are known as fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are formed over millions of years from the remains of dead organisms. Coal was formed from dead trees and other plant material. Crude oil and gas were formed from dead marine organisms. So what happens is over like a long period of time, animals that would have died in the past, all of the carbon that was stored in their bodies would have been compressed and turned into like fossil fuels such as coal and gas and other like natural, if you like, fossil fuels. Okay, so again, carbon is stored, and we use these as a source of energy. So what we can do is we can burn them, and we can release the energy that's trapped inside the inside coal or gas, for example. Rocks. So again, you have, like if you take the Earth, you have all different types of rocks that goes right down to the core. So rocks of the Earth's crust contain carbon, such as limestone or calcium carbonate. So limestone, for example, is a big source of carbon as well. There's carbon incorporated into the structure of limestone. And then the oceans then as well. So if you think about a lot of the Earth is made up of oceans. So the oceans contain dissolved CO2. So some of the CO2 gas goes into the dissolves into the oceans. You have these other substances like bicarbonates. So this is what it looks like. It's a hydrogen attached to a carbon attached to 3 oxygens, and you can see there's a carbon in here as well. And carbonate ions. So CO3, and it has carbon again as its center point as well. So these are stores of carbon, or places in nature where you're going to find a lot of carbon. So as you can see, there's carbon everywhere. It's pretty much in everything all around us. So the carbon transferring processes such as photosynthesis, respiration, and burning. So I talked about photosynthesis and respiration. So these are the ways that carbon is transferred around, if you like, in the environment. So for example, animals, they go through the process of respiration. So they take in food and they take in oxygen and they burn the carbon dioxide and they create CO2. So that CO2 goes into the environment, like what we've mentioned here. Okay, so they're taking in glucose, they're taking in oxygen, and then they're burning the glucose and they're turning that into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And then you have photosynthesis, where again CO2 has been taken out of the environment and it's been put into glucose molecules. So for example, CO2, so green plants are taking some carbon dioxide into through the process of photosynthesis, they're making glucose. Then also, well, the plants are burning glucose as well, and they're releasing some carbon dioxide back into the environment as well. And then the other other major cycle then is fuel. So like we said, the fossil fuels. So we've learned how to mine coal and oil and all of these fossil fuels. And essentially all they are is just the remains of dead animals and plants that have been compressed into materials that we can then burn to release energy. So it's combustion. But when we burn these materials, what it does is it releases carbon dioxide into the environment as well. So these are the main ways in which carbon cycles through the environment, through these process of photosynthesis, respiration, and combustion or burning. So carbon enters the atmosphere as carbon dioxide from respiration and combustion. Carbon dioxide is absorbed by plants to make glucose in photosynthesis. Animals feed on the plant, passing the carbon compounds along the food chain. So when animals eat the plants, carbon gets passed into their body. And then when other animals eat those, it continues to get passed through the environment, through nature. Most of the carbon they consume is exhaled as carbon dioxide. That was formed during aerobic respiration. So the animals and plants eventually die. So then what happens is when the animals and plants die, you've decomposers, they break down the dead organisms and return the carbon in their bodies to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide by respiration. So when animals and plants die, you have these organisms, microscopic organisms like decomposers, and they basically break down the plants and animals and return their minerals, if you like, back into the environment. In some conditions, decomposition is blocked, and the plants and animal materials may then be available as fossil fuels for combustion in the future. So what can happen then as well is if this decomposition process is interrupted, those plants and animals can be compressed and turned into things like fossil fuels. So these are how some of the ways that carbon is transferred through the environment, or the carbon cycle. So this is a nice, so it's a carbon cycle diagram. So we have CO2 in the atmosphere, so you have carbon dioxide. So again, you have so oil, coal, and gas. So in modern society, we use these as fuels. So deforestation and burning fossil fuels releases locked away carbon as CO2. So when we burn these fossil fuels, it releases the carbon that's locked away in them into the atmosphere in the form of CO2. The other way then is that you have animals, for example, that die, and then you have decomposers like bacteria and fungi. So decomposers, fungi and bacteria digest dead biomass. So biomass is just like dead animal things that were alive that are dead and are being eaten, and use it as a source of fuel for respiration. So basically these decomposers, they need to make energy, and what they do is they consume dead animals and plants to do that. And CO2 is released into the atmosphere as gas, and it's as a waste product. It's basically a waste product of respiration, CO2. So animals eat plants, biomass. Some of the carbon is turned into biomass and some is turned into CO2 during respiration. So when animals eat plants, some of the carbon that's in the plants will become part of the animal's body. So that's what it means. It can contribute to the biomass of the animal, but then a lot of it then will be burned up. The glucose will be burned up and CO2 will be released into the environment. And then green plants take in CO2 for photosynthesis, so carbon is turned into plant biomass. So again, plants, through the process of photosynthesis, they absorb some carbon dioxide from the environment. So deforestation reduces the amount of CO2 that trees remove from the environment as well. So the less trees we have, the less of this taking the carbon dioxide out of the environment that happens. So that's a nice diagram that kind of summarizes this, what we've been talking about, the carbon cycle. So this then is an even more simplified version of it. So again, it's the same process. So fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas, they're burned, releases CO2 into the environment. Carbon compounds such as humus and soil, so bacteria, so through respiration, then bacteria release CO2 back into the environment. Carbon compounds such as proteins in animals, so for example, when animals eat other plants, they take in carbon containing compounds such as proteins, and that gets incorporated into the animal. Carbon compounds such as glucose in plants, so again, you have, through the process of photosynthesis, the CO2 is being converted into glucose, and then through respiration, some of that glucose is being burned up by the plant, and it releases some CO2 back into the environment as well. So again, this is a very important diagram that you need to be able to reproduce. And that's if you like, kind of like what we mean by the carbon cycle. Another process that happens then is limestone formation and acid rain reactions. So limestone is a sedimentary rock formed by the accumulation of sediments rich in carbonate minerals underwater. Okay, so ocean-dwelling organisms such as oysters, clams, mussels, and coral, they use calcium carbonate. So this is like a compound that's in the water. So they use this calcium carbonate. It's found in seawater to create their shells, and also as well to create bones as well. So this calcium carbonate is taken in by these organisms, and they use it, to make their shells and to make bones as well. And then what happens is, as these organisms die, their shells and bones are broken down by waves, and they settle by the ocean floor, where they are compacted over millions of years. And this compaction over millions of years creates what's called limestone from the sediments and the pressure of the ocean water. So you can imagine this is the ocean here, and you have all this sediments of calcium carbonate. Over years, it all gets compressed and compact, and it turns into limestone. So as these organisms die, their shells and bones are broken down, and that's what happens. It gets compressed into limestone. So limestone or calcium carbonate reacts. So this limestone or calcium carbonate, it reacts very readily with acid. So rain. So for example, rain is slightly acidic. This is caused by dissolved gases in the rain. So rain, by its nature, by what's in the atmosphere, it's slightly acidic. When rain falls on limestone, if this rain falls on limestone, it reacts with the calcium carbonate that's in it, and it releases CO2 back into the atmosphere as well. So you can see here, so we have limestone here, and you can see here that it's been eroded over time. So what's happening is the rain is falling on top of it, and rain is slightly acidic, so that causes like a chemical reaction to happen, and that chemical reaction releases carbon dioxide back into the environment as well. So that's another way that that carbon, if you like, it cycles through the environment. So the organisms use it as part of their structure. The organisms die, the sea compresses it into limestone, then some of that limestone can wash up on the shore, and rain then can rain down on the limestone. Rain is slightly acidic, and it causes a chemical reaction, and that can release CO2 back into the environment as well. So that's the carbon cycle, and that's how carbon cycles through the environment. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move and look at how water moves, so H2O, how that moves around in the environment. So first thing we're going to do, we looked at the carbon stores, so we're going to look at water stores. So water storage areas are known as reservoirs, so there are places where there's lots of water. So if we look, so this is a picture of the globe. 97% of Earth's water is found as salt water in the ocean. So if you look at this, you can see the majority of the water on the Earth's surface is found in our seas and our oceans. It's in the form of salt water. So fresh water is found in ice caps. So up like the north and down the south, you have ice caps, and they contain fresh water. You also have groundwater, so like just water that's fresh water that's in the ground. And then you have lakes and rivers. So think about around where you live, there's probably lakes and rivers around you. And in the atmosphere is water vapor or in clouds as well. So this water is all around the earth in all different forms. And the interesting thing to think about as well is that that water has been around as long as the earth has been here. So the water that's inside you, the water that's inside the bottle that you might be drinking out of, that water has been around as long as the earth has been here. So it's probably been through the water molecules that are in your bottle of water that you're drinking, probably has been, would have been through all of these cycles that we're going to look at next. So living organisms need water as a component of body fluids and a constituent of the cell cytoplasm. So if you remember in first year, we would have looked at the structure of the cell. So if you take the structure of a cell, for example, so all living things are made up of cells. So you have the cell body, sorry, the membrane, okay, and then you have the nucleus inside here in the middle. That's like the control center. But then you've all these other organelles that are inside the cell. But inside the cell, you have cytoplasm. And cytoplasm essentially is water. Okay, so your body is made up of trillions of these cells, and inside those cells, you have it's like a bag full of this stuff called cytoplasm, and cytoplasm is mainly made up of water. Water in living things provides a medium for chemical reactions and acts as a solvent to transport materials. Water is used to regulate body temperature as well. So in the blood, you have plasma, and the plasma is mainly made up of water, for example, and that's used to regulate body temperature and keep the temperature in your body at an optimal temperature. Also as well, it offers a medium for chemical reactions to take place. So if we take, for example, this process here, respiration. So where does this, so this here is this is a chemical reaction here. So you have all of these chemical reactions reacting. Where does this happen? Respiration. So it happens inside the cell. Okay, so it happens inside the cell. You have these structures called mitochondrion, and this is basically where respiration happens. Now, what also has to happen is this glucose, for example. So let's say our glucose molecule, it has to be transported into the cell. Okay, so and it also needs a medium. So inside here, it's like so imagine this is these are your glucose molecules, and what's going to happen is they're transported into the cell, and then in the cell they have to be transported to the mitochondrion. So again, it's easy for the cell to do that if it's in this in cytoplasm, which is like like a watery substance. It allows the materials to float around and move around inside the cell. The same then with oxygen then as well. So if we take oxygen here, so oxygen again has to be, so imagine we've all this oxygen outside here. That oxygen has to be transported through the blood into the cells, and then it also has to be transported down here to the site where respiration is going to happen as well. So water plays a massive role in that, because mainly the animal cell is mainly made up of water. So, and water then also is used to regulate body temperature then as well. So there's some of the stores of water. So water storage areas are known as reservoirs, as we're saying. So this kind of this breaks down just what I've been talking about as well. So we can see here that so total global water, that the majority of the water is from oceans. Okay, so it's mainly like nearly 96.5%. Then you have these slight, so fresh water then is about 2.3%. And if we take the fresh water, for example, where does that come from? So fresh water then, so the glaciers and ice caps, so the majority of fresh water is in the glaciers and ice caps on the North and South Pole. Then you have groundwater, so there's water in the ground. And then you have what's known as surface water. And then if we take surface water and other fresh water, so what's the breakdown of that? So again, ground, ice, and permafrost. So the majority of that surface water is in the form of ice, so on the caps. Then like some of it is in lakes. Okay, so a good bit of it's in lakes. Some of it then is in soil moisture. Then you have like swamps and marshes, rivers, living things. So living things contain some of that water then as well. And then about 3% of that then is in the atmosphere then as well. So you can see these are this, it's a nice kind of graphic. It gives you the breakdown of where water is in relation to the earth. So it's, again, like carbon, water is everywhere. So water transferring processes, so again, like the carbon transferring processes, water is transported around. So you have transpiration, evaporation, and condensation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about each of these. So water turns from a liquid to a gas when in evaporation. So energy from the sun evaporates water from lakes and oceans into water vapor in the atmosphere. So if we we have like the states of matter. So you have, for example, you have water. Okay, and then if energy is taken away, it turns into ice. If energy is added to it and it's heated up, it'll turn into steam. Okay, so these are what are known as the states of matter. So in condensation, water cools and is converted from gas to liquid, often forming small suspended droplets of water in clouds. So again, you can see condensation also as well. If you breathe on a cold glass surface, the water that's in your breath will cool down and form droplets on the glass. So the same thing happens as well in the atmosphere. So precipitation occurs when water droplets combine to form bigger droplets that fall as rain, snow, hail, and sleet fall from the sky. So water that isn't absorbed into the ground after precipitation can run along the surface of ground, forming rivers. Water that soaks into the ground can be stored within underwater rocks called forming aquifers. And then you have what's known as transpiration. So transpiration is the loss by evaporation of water from leaves to continuously pull more water up from the roots. So plants need to maintain a constant stream of water to their leaves for photosynthesis and support and transport of materials then as well. Okay, so if we take evaporation, essentially the sun heats up like the oceans and rivers, and what happens is the liquid water then starts to turn into steam and it starts to evaporate off. Okay, so this is one process of evaporation. Then what will happen is that evaporated material, when the sun starts to move on, it'll start to cool down, it'll start to come together as droplets, and then it'll condense and it'll precipitate, and it'll come back out of the atmosphere and fall to the earth as rain, for example, or sleet or snow. Again, plants, as I was saying, plants need to photosynthesize. What they do is they absorb water from the ground. That's soaked into the ground. It's brought up through their leaves to carry out the process of photosynthesis. But what happens then as well is some of that excess water, it's removed from the leaves through this process called transpiration. So essentially, transpiration is where the water vapor evaporates off the leaves. So water vapor lost from the leaf pours in transpiration. So, and then that goes into the atmosphere. It's evaporated into the atmosphere then as well. So these are the water transferring processes. So you need to know them. So evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and then transpiration. So they're the main ones. Okay, so atmospheric pressure, cloud formation, and rain. So when the pressure is low, so in the atmosphere, air saturated with water vapor is free to rise into the atmosphere where it cools. As the air cools, it can't hold as much water vapor, and condensation happens with the help of tiny particles floating around in the air, such as dust. These particles provide surfaces on which water vapor can change into liquid droplets or ice crystals. Clouds are made of water droplets or ice crystals that are so small and light that they are able to stay in the air. Eventually, the water vapor in the cloud condenses and falls as rain, sleet, or snow. So essentially what's happening is, so you have this process of evaporation. So you have like so water, for example, is evaporated into the atmosphere, and then in the atmosphere, what happens is, so you can imagine you have water vapor and you have these tiny dust particles. So what will happen is the water vapor will condense. It'll all start to kind of come together into bigger and bigger drops, and that's helped by these dust particles that are in the atmosphere. And then what's going to happen is, as these particles and dust and water molecules start to come together, they'll form into bigger and bigger objects like clouds. And then eventually what will happen is it'll cool down sufficiently that that water that these tiny droplets of water will come together and they'll fall to the earth then as water droplets, as precipitation. So again, these are ways that that water, for example, is moved, that the like water cycles, if you like, through the environment. So these are the main kind of ways then that it happens. So you have evaporation. Okay, then what happens is that water that evaporates, it condenses into clouds. Those clouds then release through precipitation, the rain falls to the earth as snow or sleet or hail. What happens then, it collects into rivers and lakes. Then you have runoff that runs back into so that water runs back into the seas, and then it goes back through this evaporation cycle. Some of the water then is collected in as groundwater. That water that's collected as groundwater is absorbed by plants. The excess water then in the plants goes to the leaves, and then it's through transpiration, it's evaporated out of the leaves back into the environment as well. So you continuously get this cycle of water cycling through nature, and this is what's known as the water cycle. So again, this is a nice graphic that just kind of condenses it all down into a simple thing. Again, it's very important that you're able to reproduce this diagram as well. Okay, so again, oceans are sources of water. Water is evaporated into clouds. Clouds condense. So you have clouds formed. Then what happens is clouds condense, and then water precipitates out of the clouds, falls into the ground. Groundwater then can be absorbed through plants, through the roots, and then through the process of transpiration, that excess water can be released out of the plant's leaves and back into the atmosphere to go again through cycles of cloud formation. And then some of that groundwater as well that's not absorbed by plants runs off through rivers and lakes back into the ocean, and you continuously get this cycling that happens. So some simple experiments that we will do in the lab that we can look at to show these processes. So we can look at detecting CO2. So the CO2 produced from combustion and respiration can be detected using lime water. So you have this substance called lime water. When carbon dioxide passes through lime water, okay, calcium, so it's a calcium hydroxide solution, it turns like a milky color due to the formation of solid precipitate of insoluble calcium carbonate. So this is the same calcium carbonate that organisms use to make their shells. So again, if you have this simple setup here, you put some lime water in, and if you're to blow through this, what will happen is this will turn milky. And the reason it's turning milky is because you're getting calcium carbonate formed. The other thing then that we can do as well is if you take a Bunsen burner and you burn a fossil fuel, so that's through the process of combustion, what's going to happen is it's going to release carbon dioxide into the test tube, and that will go into the lime water. Once it goes into the lime water, then it'll turn milky because it's creating this calcium carbonate. And again, this is a nice way to show the presence of carbon dioxide, okay, using lime water. So carbon dioxide will turn lime water milky. The other process that we can do as well is we can use copper sulfate. Anhydrous just means there's no water in it, it's really dry. So anhydrous copper sulfate is white because it has no water in it. So the reaction between anhydrous copper sulfate and water is used as a test for water to show that there's water present. The white solution turns blue in the presence of water. So this reaction is exothermic. That means that when the reactants react together, it releases heat energy. So energy is transferred to the surroundings. When water is added to anhydrous copper sulfate, enough heat is released to make the water bubble and boil. Okay, so we can take our anhydrous copper sulfate and put it into a little dish like so, and then if we use a pipette and we add water to it, it'll turn milky. And if you put your hand underneath this as well, the chemical reaction is what's known as exothermic. It'll be warm. So how do you show then that there's water in the environment? Well, if you take a test tube and you fill it up with ice cubes and water, what's going to happen is it's going to create a cold surface. The water in the atmosphere, when it touches the outside of this test tube, it's going to condense and it'll form like a water residue on the outside of the test tube. And then if you then, let's say, if you were to take some of this water that's on the outside of the test tube and you're to add copper sulfate to it, anhydrous copper sulfate, it'll turn a blue color. And what that shows is that there is dissolved water in the environment that's in the atmosphere. And again, we look at these and we do these. And the next one then is what's known as transpiration investigation. So again, this is a nice simple one to do as well. So if you take a plant and if you put a bag over the plant and you just observe it over the space of a week, leaves lose water through tiny openings called stoma in the process called transpiration. So in the leaves, plants will lose water through this process of transpiration. So if you tie a clear bag around a leaf of a plant and water the plant well, after 2 to 3 days, condensation droplets appear inside the bag. This can be shown to be water using anhydrous copper sulfate. So you can take this out and you can test it to see that it is indeed water using the copper sulfate. Place the roots of a young plant in a test tube of water and record the water level. The oil layer prevents surface evaporation. So another thing you can do then as well is you can take a plant and you can put it into like a test tube and you can put a layer of oil here so it stops the water evaporating through the layer of oil. And you can monitor the level of the water. So what you'll find is over a period of time, the roots are going to drink up the water and the water level will reduce. And what's going to happen is you're going to get transpiration. Some of that water is going to leave the leaves. So place the roots of a young plant in a test tube of water and record the water level. The oil layer prevents surface evaporation. As transpiration occurs, the plant draws more water into the roots and the water level drops. So the water level drops faster in warmer, windy conditions where the transpiration rate increases. So again, if it's warm and windy, what's going to happen is that water will be blown off the leaves and it'll evaporate more readily. So you'll find that the water level will drop much quicker. So that is the water cycle. So let's just go back. So just to kind of think about what we've looked at. So students should be able to describe the cycling of matter. So we've looked at the carbon cycle and the water cycle, including that of carbon and water. So we've looked at how carbon and water cycle through nature and associated with biological and atmospheric phenomena. So for example, you have biological phenomena like respiration and photosynthesis, and organisms eat plants and they consume water. And then also atmospheric phenomena as well, so like things like rain and sleet, they're all atmospheric phenomena that happen as a result of the cycling of matter through nature. Okay, so thank you for your time and thank you for listening.